Why you wouldn't last a night in a medieval brothel. Boring history for sleep. The streets are quiet now. Not silent. Medieval towns were never truly silent, but quiet enough that you can hear your own breath, your own footsteps, and the faint drip of water from the gutter. It is the year 1356. A cold wind slides through the narrow alleys of a town somewhere in Western Europe, maybe in England, or Flanders, or the edge of the Holy Roman Empire. It doesn't really matter. Because in every town of the Middle Ages, there was a place like this. A place of candlelight and whispers. Of perfume mixed with sweat. Of laughter that didn't quite sound real. A brothel. You walk slowly down a cobblestone path, uneven and slick with the damp of the night. The walls lean toward you, close, crooked, breathing the stale air of the centuries. Ahead, a dim red glow slips through a half-shuttered window. And there, behind a wooden door marked only by a small lantern, lies the kind of place that polite society pretended not to know existed. But it did. It always did. The door creaks open. Not because you knocked, but because someone inside opened it for you. A woman, though in this faint light, she looks more like a shadow draped in cloth. Her voice is quiet, practiced, almost kind. Come in, if you've got coin. Inside, the air is thick. Not warm, but heavy, with the smell of tallow candles, unwashed bodies, and the faint sweetness of old wine. You blink. It takes a moment for your eyes to adjust. A wooden table. A few stools. A jug of something that might once have been wine. And faces, tired, powdered with flour to hide the marks of time. In the Middle Ages, brothels were not the glamorous dens of silk and perfume that stories sometimes suggest. They were legal, often regulated, but always seen as a necessary shame, a sin tolerated for the sake of controlling worse sins. In London, the district of Southwark was infamous for its stews, bathhouses that doubled as brothels. The church officially disapproved, yet the bishops owned much of the land there. Sin, it turned out, could be profitable. In Paris, they were called maisons de joie, houses of joy. In Florence, caisse di tolleranza, tolerated houses. Every city had its euphemisms, as if words could soften what was really happening inside. The room you're standing in would not have felt luxurious. The floors are rough planks, scattered with straw to soak up the mess of the night. The walls are dark with soot and smoke from years of tallow lamps. There is no glass in the windows, only shutters and thin fabric that barely hold back the cold. The candles burn low. Their wax drips slowly, silently, onto the table. Somewhere upstairs, footsteps move, slow, tired, rhythmic. A door closes. A laugh echoes. Then silence again. For a few coins, a man could buy what he wanted. Or at least what he thought he wanted. The women here came from everywhere, some orphans, some widows, some simply hungry. Few had a choice. Some were bound by debt, others by circumstance. And though the church preached repentance, the truth was that no one offered these women any other way to live. They were both visible and invisible, needed and despised. A paradox that defined much of medieval morality. If you listen closely, you might hear a lute being played in the next room. A simple tune, something sad, almost aimless. Music, even soft and broken, helped keep the silence away. A jug of ale passes from one hand to another. Coins clink on the table. A tired laugh. And another candle dies. The night in a medieval brothel didn't move quickly. It dragged, heavy with exhaustion, cheap drink, and the slow turning of time. There was no clock, only the fading of the fire, the sound of the street beyond the shutters, and the quiet rustle of the women moving between rooms. In the corner, one sits by the hearth, her face turned to the flickering light. She stares into it, not really seeing, only thinking of something far away. Maybe a child she lost. Maybe a home she left. Maybe nothing at all. You might think, standing here, that you could last the night. That you could keep your composure, stay curious, observe history quietly. But the truth is, you wouldn't. Not because of danger. Not because of scandal. But because the air itself feels too heavy, too full of the ache of people who have given too much of themselves to survive another day. This is not a place of pleasure. It's a place of endurance. And by the soft, uneven glow of the candles, you realize that the people here are not characters in a story, they are just people, trying to live through the night. Outside, the wind sighs through the alley. The lantern above the door flickers. And in that dim light, you finally see the truth. The medieval brothel was not a place of sin, or even of desire, it was a mirror held up to poverty, loneliness, and survival. A place where the human need for touch met the brutal indifference of the world. You take a step back toward the door. The woman who let you in watches quietly, her face unreadable. She doesn't ask you to stay. She doesn't have to. You nod, a silent thanks, perhaps, and step back into the cold night. Behind you, the door closes with a sound that feels older than time. And once again, the alley is just an alley. Dark. Empty. Waiting for the next pair of footsteps. Why you wouldn't last a night in a medieval brothel. Boring history for sleep. Asterisk. The door closes behind you, and for a moment, you just stand there, breathing. The air inside feels almost alive, heavy, layered, complicated. It clings to your throat like a whisper that doesn't want to fade. There's smoke from the candles, the bitter edge of sweat, the sweetness of cheap wine, and something else, something damp and human and old. In the quiet glow, you can see the haze drift through the room, thin gray ribbons that twist slowly in the candlelight. The sound of distant footsteps upstairs blends with the murmur of a low, tired laugh from a corner table. Someone coughs. Someone else pours a drink. And somewhere in the back, you hear the soft squeak of a bed frame. To modern ears, this would seem unbearable. But for the people of the Middle Ages, this was ordinary. Bathing was rare, soap expensive, and perfume reserved for the wealthy. Most people smelled of earth, of labor, of smoke from their hearth fires. A brothel's air was simply a thicker version of the world outside, full of life, and decay, and the unending closeness of people packed into cities that never slept clean. And yet, even here, there was care. In one corner, a woman stirs a small pot of herbs over a flame, rosemary, maybe thyme, sometimes mint if she could find it. These were not for flavor but for scent, meant to soften the odor that crept through every beam and floorboard. The pot hisses. A wisp of steam curls upward. For a moment, the air smells almost pleasant, sharp and green, like a memory of the fields beyond the town. You take a slow step deeper inside. The floor creaks beneath you. You notice the uneven boards, warped by years of footsteps and spilled ale. The walls lean slightly, not out of design, but out of exhaustion. They have seen too much, held too many secrets whispered into the night. On the table nearest you, a candle has burned almost to the end. Its flame trembles every time someone moves. Melted wax pools around the base, trapping the remains of an old fly. A man and woman sit there, not talking. Just sitting. Their faces lit in that soft, uncertain light that makes everything seem half real. He stares at his hands. She stares at the floor. They don't touch. They don't need to. The moment itself is the transaction, the company, the pause between loneliness and sleep. Medieval brothels were rarely what the word brothel now suggests. For many, they were closer to taverns, half social house, half shelter, where the poor, the lonely, and the unwanted crossed paths. You could buy a drink, a song, a moment of laughter. And if you had coin, you could buy time upstairs. But the rooms above were small, barely furnished. A wooden bed, a coarse wool blanket, a single candle that might last an hour. Sheets were washed when they could be, which was not often. And in winter, the chill of the stone walls crept into everything, even the skin. There's a quiet dignity in how the women move here. Their dresses are worn but carefully mended. A ribbon tied in hair, a necklace made of brass or glass beads. Little things that say, "I am still someone." They carry small pouches of herbs or crushed flowers, sometimes pinned to their sleeves. The scent hides the worst smells, and offers something gentler to those who come close. They laugh easily, but the laughter never lasts long. It flickers like the candlelight, bright for a second, then gone. You find yourself near the hearth now, where a slow fire burns in a clay-lined pit. The warmth feels heavy rather than comforting, too much smoke, too little air. Above it hangs a pot, blackened with soot. Inside, thin stew, mostly water, a few onions, maybe a bone. The smell is faint but familiar. For many women who worked in brothels, this was their only meal of the day, a bowl of broth, some bread, perhaps a scrap of cheese from a generous patron. They ate quickly, quietly, between customers. Sometimes together, sometimes alone. And every so often, one of them would glance toward the door, as if waiting for someone who would never come. A few centuries later, historians would dig through town records and find their names, written in the ink of the city clerks who taxed them, fined them, and licensed their work. Agnes of the Lane, *. Marion of the Field, *. Isolde, daughter of no one, *. Each name a brief flicker in the dark, a trace of a life lived mostly unseen. To the city, they were necessary. To the church, they were sinners. To the men who visited, they were comfort or curiosity. But to themselves, they were simply surviving the night. A soft rain begins outside, faint at first, then steadier, tapping gently against the shutters. The sound seems to soothe the room, pulling the edges of the world closer together. A woman hums a tune, slow, low, a melody from the countryside. No one speaks for a while. In that moment, the brothel feels less like a place of vice and more like a place of waiting. Waiting for morning. Waiting for silence. Waiting for a world that might someday forget. The air moves again, stirred by a door opening somewhere upstairs. A man descends the narrow stairs, buttoning his tunic. He drops a few coins onto the table, not looking at anyone. The woman who follows a few steps later doesn't look either. She walks to the hearth, sits down, and holds her hands out to the fire. Her fingers tremble slightly. No one says a word. The air feels thick again, filled with the weight of what cannot be spoken, the tiredness, the routine, the strange peace of having nowhere else to go. If you could smell it now, truly smell it, the candle smoke, the sweat, the herbs, the ale, the faint iron scent of blood or wine, you might step back. You might open a window, take a breath of cold night air, and realize why you would not last long here. It's not just the smell. It's the closeness. The heat of bodies, the absence of privacy, the mingling of lives too tightly woven together to be separated again. It is the feeling of being trapped inside the pulse of a world that never stops breathing, never stops aching. And yet, here, life goes on, slow, tired, human. Someone laughs again, softly this time. The sound drifts through the smoky air like a ghost. The pot over the fire bubbles. The rain keeps falling. And in the dim glow of a candle, a woman begins to braid her hair, preparing for another visitor, another hour, another night that will eventually blur into all the others. Why you wouldn't last a night in a medieval brothel. Boring history for sleep *. The rain has slowed. Only a soft dripping remains, somewhere beyond the shutters. Inside, the air has thickened again, warm, smoky, still. Around the low fire sit 3 women. They don't speak much. They never have to. One mends a torn sleeve with thread so thin it breaks every few stitches. Another smooths her hair with a small bone comb, its teeth uneven from years of use. The third just stares into the flame, her fingers absently tracing circles on her knees. The night stretches before them like an old road they've walked too many times. In the Middle Ages, women rarely chose this life. Some had been servants dismissed without pay. Some had fled bad marriages. Some had lost everything to plague or war. And others had simply been born poor, without land, without a dowry, without the invisible currency that allowed a woman to marry respectably. A brothel was not freedom, but it was survival. In a world where work for women paid almost nothing, where hunger came quickly and mercy slowly, the brothel offered at least a roof, a meal, and the faint illusion of choice. For many, that was enough. Each of the women carries her own story, though few would ever write them down. Names were changed often, partly for protection, partly for forgetting. If a woman left, by choice or by death, her name might be given to the next newcomer, and the cycle continued. Agnes became Anna. Anna became Belle. Belle became nobody. It was easier that way. The eldest of the three women sighs and reaches for a cup of watered wine. Her hands are rough, her eyes lined deeply from years of smoke and sleeplessness. She was once called Isabeau, though no one has spoken that name in years. When she was young, she tells the others, she used to braid flowers into her hair for midsummer festivals. She remembers the smell of the fields, the bright, green air before harvest. For a moment, her voice softens. Then she stops. Memories, here, are dangerous. They make the walls feel closer. The youngest woman, little more than 16, listens quietly. Her name is Margot. She has been here only a month. Her dress is newer, her eyes not yet dull. She still blushes when men look at her too long. The others do not tell her what time will do, they don't have to. Time will show her soon enough. In medieval towns, brothel workers often lived together like this, half family, half strangers. They shared food, shared debts, sometimes even shared illness. When one fell sick, the others took her shifts. When one died, they said a small prayer and went back to work. There was no room for mourning. Only for continuing. Upstairs, someone calls for wine. The innkeeper's wife, who runs the house and keeps the coins, shouts an order toward the kitchen. The women move without hurry, without protest. In most cities, brothel keepers were women themselves, often widows or former workers who could no longer sell youth but still knew how to keep order. They were practical, unsentimental, and always counting. Every candle burned, every jug poured, every visit upstairs, all of it meant money, taxes, survival. And each woman owed a portion of her earnings to the house. For rent. For protection. For existing. By the hearth, Margot finishes braiding her hair. She pins it with a bit of copper wire and looks into the small hand mirror beside her, a mirror darkened by age, warped like rippling water. For a moment, she studies her reflection, perhaps wondering if she still recognizes the girl she was before. The others do not ask. They know the question. They have asked it themselves too many times. Outside, a bell rings from the church tower, a deep, distant sound rolling through the wet night. Matins, maybe, or the watch changing. The women pause, listening. They cross themselves automatically, though none has been welcome in that church for years. In many towns, prostitutes were forbidden to enter holy ground. They confessed their sins to wandering priests or none at all. On feast days, they watched processions from alleys, faces half hidden beneath their shawls. Salvation, like comfort, was something they had learned to live without. Sometimes, though, a visitor would ask one of them to pray. Not for him, but with him. It was a strange kind of intimacy, two souls who both believed themselves unworthy, whispering the same words to the same distant God. The women did not speak of those moments afterward. They simply went on, adding another quiet secret to the pile. Isabeau begins to hum softly, a lullaby, perhaps, from long ago. The others join her without thinking. Their voices are low, almost like breathing, blending with the faint hiss of the fire. For a moment, the room feels lighter, almost tender. A slice of peace carved out of the night. If you were sitting there among them, you might forget where you were. The world outside, its judgments, its noise, would fade away. There would be only the rhythm of the song. The flicker of light, the warmth of bodies gathered together for no reason other than to keep the dark at bay. It is easy, centuries later, to see these women as symbols of sin, of poverty, of fallen grace. But in truth, they were simply people living in a world that gave them few choices. They laughed. They wept. They joked about customers, complained about the cold, shared scraps of bread, dreamed of spring. And when the city guards passed by outside, or when church bells marked another dawn, they went on doing what they always did, waiting. Waiting for sleep. Waiting for morning. Waiting for the small mercy of another ordinary day. Upstairs, a door shuts again. The fire sighs. Margot leans her head on Isabeau's shoulder. Neither says a word. In that stillness, you can almost feel the centuries slip away. The brothel becomes less a place and more a heartbeat, steady, tired, enduring. You wouldn't last a night here. Not because of fear, or shock, or judgment, but because of how quietly human it all is, how heavy, and tender, and endlessly the same. And as the last candle trembles, its wax pooling like spilled tears, the women close their eyes, just for a moment. Waiting for whatever comes next. Why you wouldn't last a night in a medieval brothel. Boring history for sleep. The fire has burned low again. Only a dull orange glow remains, painting the walls with restless shadows. Down here, in the quiet between footsteps, the sound of the world outside fades to nothing. And then, the door opens. Cold air slips in. Another man enters. He does not hurry. No one ever does. He removes his hood, shakes off the rain, glances around. His boots are caked with mud from the street, his cloak stiff from weather. He could be anyone, a traveler, a merchant, a soldier on leave. In the flickering light, it's hard to tell whether he's 30 or 50. The years have a way of blending on faces worn by the same tiredness. He nods toward the keeper and drops a few coins on the table. She doesn't count them, she knows the sound of silver. Then he sits. Not with a woman. Not yet. He just sits, as though he has come to rest more than to want. The truth of these places is that most men came not for lust, but for loneliness. In medieval towns, life was crowded but isolating, noise everywhere, friendship rare. The church was strict, work was endless, and affection was not something freely spoken of. Wives were often arranged, marriages practical, love quiet and seldom confessed. A brothel offered a strange kind of escape, not only of the body, but of the soul. For a few coins, a man could be seen, could be spoken to gently, could forget, just for an hour, the weight of who he was outside that door. Across Europe, the visitors to brothels came from every rank. Soldiers came first, drawn from garrisons near town walls. They brought stories of battle, songs of victory, and the smell of steel and horses. They came to feel alive again, after too many nights sleeping beside the dead. Merchants came next, men of trade and coin, used to bargaining, used to loneliness. Their hands were soft from counting money but their eyes hard from travel. They came not to conquer, but to rest. And then there were the apprentices, laborers, and sailors, men who lived by their strength and spent it quickly. They came because life offered few other comforts. A bed, a drink, a fleeting kindness, that was enough. The women watched them all. They learned to read them, the proud ones, the cruel ones, the gentle ones who said too little. They could tell, by the way a man walked or looked at his cup, what kind of night it would be. The keeper, too, had her sense. She could tell when to smile, when to pour another drink, when to tell a man the house was full. Because sometimes, the wrong kind of man could ruin everything. Medieval brothels were dangerous places in quiet ways. Violence was always possible. Drunkenness often came first, shame followed later. And when anger rose, when a man realized he had spent more than he could afford, or that what he wanted could not be bought, it was the women who paid the price. The man at the table still sits alone. He takes a sip of wine, thin, sour, but warm. He looks toward the fire, lost in thought. You might expect lust, hunger, desire in his eyes. But what you see instead is weariness. A kind of sadness too old to name. He removes a small ring from his pocket, bronze, worn smooth, and turns it over in his hand. He doesn't speak of who it belonged to. He doesn't have to. For some, the brothel was the only place they could grieve without being seen. To cry in a tavern was shameful. To cry at home, forbidden. But here, in this half-world of sin and silence, a man could simply be human for a while. A few of them came for conversation. To talk. To remember. To sit beside someone who would listen without judgment. There are records from the stews of Southwark, near London Bridge, where women wrote of men who came only to share their troubles, lost sons, failed crops, bad dreams. They paid not for flesh, but for kindness. A small, temporary mercy. And the women, who had so little of it themselves, learned to give it anyway. Of course, there were others. The loud ones, the cruel ones, the ones who believed coin could erase decency. The kind who made rules of their own, who thought suffering was part of pleasure. The brothel keepers knew them well, and feared them. For every gentleman who whispered softly, there was another who shouted, who struck, who broke what little peace existed. And when that happened, there was no law to turn to. The church might forgive him. The city might fine the house. But the woman, she simply carried on, quieter than before. Outside, the wind stirs again. The bell on the church tower tolls twice. Midnight. The man finishes his drink. He rises slowly, leaving his cup on the table. He looks toward one of the women, not the youngest, not the prettiest, but the one who looks like she might listen. Their eyes meet briefly. No words. Just a nod. Together, they climb the narrow stairs. The sound of their footsteps fades into the beams above. And the room below returns to its half-silence. What happens upstairs is not for scandal or excitement. It is simple, almost sacred in its ordinariness. Two people who will never know each other beyond this hour, sharing warmth in a world too cold to care. No romance. No illusion. Just the fragile mercy of being held. Historians once tried to categorize these men, sinners, hypocrites, lost souls. But labels fall away easily in the candlelight. They were people. Flawed, frightened, craving touch and forgiveness in equal measure. And perhaps, when dawn came, they felt the same quiet shame that all humans do when the night's illusions fade into daylight. But that, too, was part of life. And life, even when weary, goes on. Back downstairs, the keeper counts coins into a wooden bowl. The fire sighs its last breath. A woman yawns, stretching her arms toward the ceiling beams, her body outlined in gold from the dying candlelight. For a few hours more, this fragile world will continue. The laughter, the footsteps, the small, tired gestures of people trying to find warmth in each other's company. And outside, the rest of the town sleeps, unaware, or pretending to be. Why you wouldn't last a night in a medieval brothel. Boring history for sleep. The night deepens. The candles have burned low again, their flames sinking into soft pools of wax. The sounds of footsteps upstairs have faded. And all that remains is the faint creak of wood, the quiet breathing of those still awake, and the smell, thick, human, tired. You might think that the worst part of such a place would be the sin or the shame. But in truth, it was the dirt. The floorboards never stayed clean. Straw was scattered across them to catch the spills and soften the steps, but by morning it was soaked with ale, sweat, and worse. Each week, if the keeper remembered, the straw would be swept out into the alley and burned. The smell, they said, was unbearable. The beds were no better. A rough mattress stuffed with straw or wool, changed only when the insects grew too many. Sheets, if they existed at all, were rarely washed. In summer, the air buzzed with fleas and lice. In winter, the damp crept in through every crack. And yet, somehow, life went on. Disease was constant. The church called it divine punishment, physicians called it imbalance, the women called it bad luck. The most common sickness spread through skin and blood, an unspoken shadow that left rashes, fevers, blindness. It had many names: the pox, the French disease, the punishment of Venus. No one understood how it worked. No one could stop it. The herbs, the prayers, the purges, all were useless. A woman who caught it often simply disappeared. Some said they went to convents, others to graves. No one ever knew for sure. And yet, for all that danger, there was little choice but to continue. To stop working meant starvation. The city offered no help. The church offered forgiveness, but forgiveness did not buy bread. So they stayed. They worked through fever and exhaustion, through sickness and smoke, through every cough that rattled the walls. When one woman grew too ill, the others would care for her quietly. A damp cloth on her forehead. A whispered prayer to Saint Mary Magdalene, the saint of fallen women, the only one who might understand. Sometimes she recovered. Often, she did not. Outside, the street was no cleaner. The town ditch ran close to the brothel, carrying waste, refuse, and disease through the heart of the city. The smell of it hung in the air like fog, sweet, sour, inescapable. Rats skittered through the gutters. The rain only stirred the filth, turning it into a thin brown stream that crept beneath the door. And still, every night, the men came. As if nothing could make the world too dirty for desire. Inside, the women found small ways to protect themselves. They boiled their dresses when they could, soaked their linens in vinegar, carried sprigs of lavender and sage to keep away bad air. Some even wore amulets of tin or lead, tiny charms stamped with prayers. They had no medicine, but they had hope, and sometimes that was enough. The brothel keeper kept a small box in her room, herbs, powders, little pieces of linen soaked in oil. She said it kept away sickness. Perhaps it did, or perhaps it was simply something to believe in. Faith was as much a medicine as anything else. There were other dangers, too, not from disease or dirt, but from people. The church tolerated brothels, but only barely. Priests preached against them, and from time to time, the town council ordered them closed. When that happened, soldiers came with torches and ropes. They dragged out the women, fined the keeper, and burned what they found. A month later, the house reopened, often under a new name, sometimes even in the same place. Sin, it seemed, was easier to move than to erase. And when the church grew quieter again, the same men who ordered the closures returned as customers. Sometimes, worse things happened. A drunken night. A fight over money. A man who decided that paying meant power. There was no justice for women like these. If they cried out, few listened. If they ran, few helped. They learned instead to endure. To keep quiet. To know when to smile, and when to stay away. That was their real craft, not pleasure, not seduction, but survival. The air feels colder now. The fire has almost gone out. A faint draft moves through the cracks in the walls, carrying with it the damp smell of the street. You can almost taste the centuries in that air, the smoke, the sweat, the sickness, the small victories of those who lived and died here. They did not think of history. They did not know they would be remembered. They only knew the next hour, the next breath, the next moment of warmth before the cold returned. In some cities, reformers tried to change things. In Florence, in the 15th century, a few houses were placed under civic protection, inspected, cleaned, taxed more strictly. The women were given small rooms, linen beds, even rules about closing hours. It was meant to be mercy. But mercy, when offered from above, often feels like control. And still, beneath the new rules and painted walls, the same old air remained. The same silence. The same sadness. A rat scurries across the hearthstones. The women don't move, they've seen worse. One laughs softly, shaking her head. In her voice, there is no bitterness, only the quiet acceptance of someone who has long since stopped expecting better. They are tired, yes. But they are not broken. Even in this dirt, they find small moments of grace, a shared meal, a kind word, the rare morning when the sun slips through the shutters and warms their faces for just a moment. They live within the filth, but they refuse to become it. And you, standing in this smoke-filled room of memory, begin to understand. You would not last a night here. Not because of the disease, or the danger, or the smell. But because of the strength it takes simply to keep breathing in this air. To keep existing in a world that has already decided your worth. To smile through exhaustion, to sing through fear, to keep going when no one sees you at all. That is the quiet heroism of these forgotten lives, not beauty, not sin, but endurance. The last candle trembles, then dies. Darkness folds itself around the room. The women lie down on their beds of straw and silence. And for a few brief hours, the brothel rests. The fire cools. The air thickens again. And the night, indifferent as ever, moves on. Why you wouldn't last a night in a medieval brothel? Boring history for sleep asterisk. Midnight has passed. The fire has sunk into embers. The world outside the brothel feels distant now, a place of quiet streets and cold stone. Inside, only shadows remain. A woman stirs in her bed. She cannot sleep. Her breath is slow, her mind restless. Through the thin wall beside her, she can hear the low murmur of another voice, the sound of someone whispering to herself, or perhaps praying. These are the long hours of the night. The hours when the air feels heavy, and the silence feels alive. The hours when the past returns in fragments, and memories begin to speak. She remembers her home, not much of one, but it had a roof that didn't leak, and a mother who once sang while she worked. There was a small river nearby, and in summer, she would wash clothes in its current, feeling the cold water numb her hands. That was years ago, before famine, before the plague, before the road that led her here. In truth, few of the women in this house were born for this life. Some were widows. Some, abandoned servants. Some, simply hungry. A few were taken, sold by those who could not afford to keep them. Each one carried a story that no one asked to hear. And so the stories stayed inside, turning over slowly in their hearts like stones at the bottom of a river. The night deepens. A faint wind rattles the shutters. The moon, pale and thin, drifts through a veil of smoke. If you stood in the middle of the room now, you could almost believe time had stopped, the flicker of embers, the stillness of breath, the faint hum of distant bells marking the hour. There are moments when even the rats fall silent. Moments when the brothel feels more like a chapel than a house of sin. And in that silence, if you listen closely, you might hear something softer, the quiet rhythm of survival. Not every night was cruel. Sometimes, the men who came here were gentle. Lonely, perhaps, or frightened by the world outside. They came not for desire, but for something smaller, something more human, warmth, company, the illusion of kindness. One might speak of his wife who died in childbirth. Another, of the war he never wanted to fight. And the woman beside him, though tired, might listen. She might nod, or hum a quiet tune, or rest her head against his shoulder just long enough to make him feel seen. It was an illusion, yes, but an illusion that both of them needed. Elsewhere, another woman sits by the window. She has drawn the shutters open just enough to see the moonlight fall on the rooftops. Her hair is loose, her dress half undone, her eyes distant. She does not think of tomorrow. Tomorrow will come with the same hunger, the same faces, the same smoke. Tonight, she allows herself a moment of stillness, a single breath that belongs only to her. She watches the faint glow of the city beyond the wall, the baker's fire, the guard's torch, the flicker of light from a tavern sign. Each spark feels like a tiny heartbeat in the sleeping body of the city. And she thinks, perhaps, that the city is not cruel at all. It is simply alive. And she, too, is part of it, for better or worse. Hours pass slowly here. The air grows heavier with each breath. You could measure time by the way the candles melt, or by the rhythm of distant bells that echo across the rooftops, one for each hour of darkness. In the poorest parts of town, curfew bells had long since rung. Only watchmen walk the streets now, cloaked in furs, carrying small lanterns that swing like golden ghosts. Their boots splash through puddles, their breath drifts like smoke. Sometimes they pause outside the brothel, listening, but they never knock. This place belongs to the night, and to those who survive it. Inside, the women dream. Not of luxury or freedom, those things are too far away. They dream of small comforts. A warm loaf of bread. A clean blanket. The voice of someone calling their name kindly, as if it still mattered. Even dreams are humble here. But they are theirs. And in a world that has taken everything else, that, too, is a form of defiance. There are nights when laughter echoes through the hall, low, tired laughter, the kind that rises from exhaustion and ends in silence. A joke shared between the women, an old song sung off-key, the scraping of a bowl against the table. It is not joy, exactly. It is survival disguised as joy. They have learned that laughter confuses despair. If you laugh at it, it retreats for a moment. And that moment, however brief, can feel like mercy. The air now smells of smoke, wax, and faint perfume, lavender, rosewater, musk. But beneath it all lies another scent, one you cannot wash away. The smell of life lived too close to the edge. The smell of human struggle. You would not last a night here. Not because of the dirt or the danger, but because of the silence that fills the hours between midnight and dawn. A silence so deep it begins to echo your own thoughts back to you. It is in that silence that the truth of this place lives. Each woman here carries two selves. The one the world sees, painted, smiling, obedient. And the one hidden beneath, tired, yearning, endlessly human. Sometimes, when the night is kind, those two selves meet for a moment. They breathe together. And for a heartbeat, she remembers who she was before all this. A girl by the river. A daughter. Someone who dreamed of something else. Then, as the cock crows faintly in the distance, that memory fades again, as all things do in the long hours of night. The city begins to stir. Not yet morning, but close. A faint light bleeds into the edges of the shutters. The women shift in their beds. The first birds call out. The long night is nearly over. But before it ends, there is always that strange, in-between hour, not night, not day, when time seems to hold its breath. And in that breath, you can almost hear the heartbeat of the forgotten. The sound of hundreds of nights lived and lost. The whisper of women who once sat here, waiting for morning. Knowing it would come, and knowing it would change nothing. Still, they waited. Still, they endured. The last ember fades to ash, asterisk. The sky turns pale gray, asterisk. The night releases its hold, asterisk. And as you listen, you feel the same slow stillness. A reminder that history is not made of kings and battles alone, but of countless quiet nights, lived and forgotten, by people who simply tried to make it until morning. Why you wouldn't last a night in a medieval brothel. Boring history for sleep. Morning comes quietly, as it always does. There is no sunrise here, not yet, not in this narrow corner of the city. Only a faint gray light seeps through the cracks in the shutters, touching the floor like the first thought after a long dream. The night is over. The candles are cold. The fire, long forgotten, is now only a bed of ash. The world outside has begun to wake. Somewhere, a baker opens his door. A cart creaks over the cobblestones. The church bell tolls the hour, soft and distant, echoing across the rooftops like the sigh of a tired god. Inside the brothel, silence holds for just a moment longer. The women sleep in fragments, half dreams, half memories. Their breathing rises and falls with the rhythm of the city's heart. One by one, they begin to stir. A cough. A stretch. A rustle of fabric. The soft sound of bare feet touching the cold floor. They move slowly, carefully, as if not to wake the ghosts that still linger from the night before. There is no glamour here in daylight. The painted faces of evening are smudged and pale. The perfume that once floated through the air now mingles with the scent of sweat and smoke. The silk ribbons have lost their shape. The laughter has vanished into the cracks of the wood. The brothel in morning light looks like any other poor house, rough, tired, filled with the remains of what life demanded. And yet, there is a strange peace in it. The kind that comes not from comfort, but from the simple act of surviving another night. The keeper of the house walks through the rooms, slow and quiet. She carries a small bucket of water, pouring a little into each basin. Her face is lined with years of smoke and worry, but her hands are steady. She has seen 100 mornings like this, maybe more. She hums under her breath, an old tune from before she learned to count coins and collect debts. It's a song without words, a melody that sounds like forgetting. In the kitchen, a small fire is coaxed back to life. A few scraps of bread are warmed on the hearth. Someone pours ale into a cracked cup, not for celebration, but for strength. Breakfast here is not a feast, it is simply the first thing to keep the day from feeling empty. Outside, footsteps echo. Vendors setting up for the market. Children calling to each other. A distant rooster that sounds too tired to crow. The city stretches, yawns, and begins again. One of the younger women stands at the window, hair tangled, eyes soft with sleep. She watches the street, the people passing by who never look up, who never wonder what happens behind these walls. To them, this place is invisible in daylight. A shadow that only exists when night falls. And perhaps, she thinks, that is a kind of mercy. To be unseen, when seeing hurts too much. She turns away from the window and sits down, brushing her hair with slow, absent strokes. Each pull of the comb is like the turning of time, steady, patient, inevitable. Later, the brothel will open its doors again. The candles will be lit. The same songs will play, the same faces will smile. Night will return, and the cycle will begin once more. But for now, there is this quiet hour, this fragile pause between endings and beginnings. An hour when everything feels softer, almost human again. If you listen closely, you can hear the sound of life trying to start over. History rarely records these moments. It remembers kings and crusades, plagues and wars. It tells of empires rising and falling. But it does not tell of this, of a woman pouring water into a wooden bowl, of another warming her hands above a fading fire, of the small, unseen gestures that make survival possible. Yet it is here, in this quiet morning, that the truest part of the past still lives. In every breath, in every motion, in every whisper that says, I am still here. Outside, the sun finally breaks through the clouds. It glances off the rooftops, the stone walls, the puddles left from the night's rain. It slips through the shutter cracks, landing on a face that turns toward the warmth. For a brief moment, everything glows, the dust, the air, the eyes half opened in wonder. And then it passes, gentle as a sigh. If you were standing here now, in this room, in this light, you would see nothing grand. No beauty that could be painted, no story that could be sung. Just life, simple and small and endlessly repeating. And yet, there is something in that repetition, something fragile and sacred, that reminds us how much history hides behind silence. These women, forgotten by time, were not villains or angels. They were people who laughed, who wept, who endured. And in their endurance lies a kind of quiet strength that outlives the walls, the laws, the centuries. You would not last a night here. But they did. Not because they were stronger than you, but because they had no other choice. And somehow, they made even that into a kind of grace. The dawn is full now. The streets outside begin to fill with life. The brothel doors remain closed, for just a few more minutes. The last few breaths of peace before the noise begins again. And in that stillness, you can almost hear it. The faint echo of the night just past. The sigh of a world that keeps turning. And the quiet promise of another day. The bell tolls once more, asterisk. The women begin to move, asterisk. The light grows stronger, asterisk. The brothel, tired but unbroken, wakes again. Its walls holding the memory of 1,000 nights. Its rooms filled with stories that no one will ever tell. And as you listen, you drift. Not away from them, but with them. Into the soft hum of morning. Into the slow rhythm of breath. Into the peace that comes when history falls silent.